Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for the Connect and Communicate series presenting library staff morale and the academic hierarchy. This discussion will be recorded and it will be made available to the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the association website, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you will only need a headset or speakers. We are muting participants to keep the background noise down, but we encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout this discussion, and we'll attempt to include your questions as appropriate during the discussion or at the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues, so please post those issues in the chat box as well. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, including Emily Morose, Christy Edelman, Ronale Sioko, Sarah Pike, and Amy Snyder. Please contact any one of the team for information about becoming a Pennsylvania Library Association member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenters for today's event. They are all from the University of California, Berkeley, and we have Celia Emmelhines, the Anthropology and Qualitative Research Librarian, Natalia Estrada, the Political Science and Public Policy Librarian, Benita Dias, a Library Supervisor, and Ann Glusker, the Sociology, Demography, and Quantitative Research Librarian. And with that, I'd like to welcome Celia, Natalia, Benita, and Ann, and turn the presentation over to them.
Thank you so much, Diane. We are so thrilled to be here. I'm actually from Philadelphia, and so I'm especially excited to be here. We really appreciate you joining us. We will hold questions until the end, but hope that you can put them in the chat, and then we'd be thrilled to answer them. And also would love to hear from you after the presentation. Our emails will be at the end. Just please stay in touch with this as you feel so moved. So here we go. We're going to be talking about library staff morale in the academic hierarchy. We will be talking about why we became interested in staff experiences as opposed to librarian experiences, what our research process was, who we talked with, so who our respondents were, what they're saying, and then what our plans are next. We did create some learning objectives, which we hope will meet today, which is that we will be reflecting on staff roles and academic hierarchies, thinking about advocacy. We'll be thinking about the divide between librarians and staff and administrators and librarians and how those impact morale. And we'll be thinking about professional development and how career support can make a big difference to morale. And with that, I'll turn it over to Natalia.
Thank you, Anne. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the background and how we got to, where we are now. Next slide, please. So the inspiration for this, at the time that we were starting to talk or grow interest in it, Kaetrena Davis Kendrick's excellent paper, The Low Morale Experience of Academic Librarians, a phenomenological study, came out, and we were really into it. All this detail and all the work that she went into to understand what was going on with librarians in the workplace really got our attention. And all these other papers started coming out about librarian burnout and toxic workplace environment. So we thought that was interesting that all these papers were coming out, but they were all focused on librarians. As we all know, librarians are not the only ones who work in a library and make it run. So we were, disheartened to find that there were no papers, no works on library staff. And at the time, I was a library staff member before I became a librarian. And so I kind of took that personally. So Anne and I started talking a little bit more into it. So then, next slide. So we decided to start following and forming these questions around the topic. So some of our questions that we started with, we noticed that there were a lot of librarians or those who had MLIS degrees working in staff roles. but there were very few examples of staff members who make it to the librarian role. So we wanted to know what that jump looked like if it was possible. We wanted to know about staff, working in different positions outside of the hierarchy position, whether there was mobility in the hierarchy, and you wanted to take on more complex work, what the role the hierarchy had in staff morale, and more importantly, why were there so few studies on staff? As I mentioned, they're not the only one. Librarians aren't the only one who make the library work. Why was there less focus on staff? Next slide, I'm going to hand it off.
So developing our project, Natalia and I sort of got talking, and then we felt that we wanted to also include Celia, who's a wonderful colleague and happens to be an expert on qualitative research. And so that was great. And Natalia had been a staff person, but became a librarian at Berkeley. And we felt that it was very, very important to have a staff voice represented, and invited Benita to share her perspective on the team. So then we were 4, which was a great number because we actually did a lot more interviews than we expected. More on that in a second. We did get a statewide grant from the Librarians Association of the University of California, which was very welcome because there's no university-wide license for qualitative software on the Berkeley campus, so we had to buy the software ourselves. We did hire a student to do our transcription, which was wonderful. Highly recommend if you ever do this kind of research. And then we also gave the interviewees gift cards, which were super popular. So that's how that funding was used. And we applied for and received human subjects approval, and that was actually a pretty complicated process. So by the time sort of April 2020 came, so it was all planned before the pandemic, but then the pandemic hit just as we were starting to recruit, as that happens to a lot of people recently. We decided to email only to external library listservs. So we did not include Berkeley folks in our recruitment. For many reasons, which we can talk about later if people are interested. We also emailed state associations because we were trying to get something of a regional diversity. We were tending to get a lot of people from the West Coast. And we screened interested interviewees because there were a lot of people that actually had librarian positions and we were not interviewing them. And some campuses, it was very popular. So we actually had to say, we already have 3 people from your university, sorry. And then we completed 34 interviews, which was kind of a thrill because we'd hoped for 20. Luckily, the software costs were not as high as we expected because then we had to sort of pay all those extra gift cards, but it all did work out. So then we were at the point of leading the interviews, which we had the great good luck of having a colleague that led a staff colleague with whom we did a pilot interview. And we learned a lot from that interview in shaping what we would do with our respondents. We did all of the interviews either by phone or by Google Meet, which is similar to Zoom, in a 3-week period in May and June of 2020. And it was a very, very interesting time. And we feel that it was kind of a snapshot of the very last minute of what the old world was of libraries before the pandemic. At that point in May to June 2020, we've been coding and listening to the transcripts recently. People were expecting to go back to their libraries in the fall. So people were only expecting to be out for another month or 2. And when they were responding to questions, they were talking about their situation, the month prior, basically. So we know that in many cases they did not return in the fall. So it was kind of I don't know what I want to say, but it's just sort of the timing and the world situation made it so that it was a very, very interesting snapshot. We had 2 people on each interview, one person asking the questions and one taking notes. And then the interviews were semi-structured, which means that we had a set of questions that we were aiming at that sort of gave a kind of a structure to the interview, but we didn't have to keep to it so rigidly that we couldn't explore themes that the respondents were interested in. And with that, I will turn it over to Celia.
So just to give you a little bit more detail on who we were talking with, we have some kind of summary demographics. Out of the 34 interviews, we ended up pulling people from 23 colleges and 16 states. Public institutions were overrepresented in our sample, and larger institutions were also a little bit overrepresented. This graph here you can see is the census kind of regions in the US. So these are that population percentage of those census regions, and then our respondents. So you can see we had a little bit more from places like the West and fewer in the Northeast than you would expect. So we were aiming for that, but this is a fairly small qualitative sample. So we knew that we wouldn't exactly mirror those kind of demographics. Gender, race, and age were things that we asked people to voluntarily self-identify in whatever way that they wanted to. As one might expect in academic libraries, there's a majority of people that identified as female and white, but there were also 5 staff of color, 4 people who identified as male, and 2 people who identified as non-binary or genderqueer. And in terms of age, I think we had a little bit of an overrepresentation of library staff members in their 20s and 30s, kind of tapering off, as you see in this slide, to 40s, 50s, and 60s. Once we had done all of these interviews, we then had to process the data. And we're sharing this just in case you're thinking about maybe a project of your own to get a sense of how this worked for us. We recorded audio on 2 devices to avoid data loss, which was great because there were some cases in which we kind of panicked thinking that we had lost one of the copies, but we still had a backup copy. We transferred it to a secure online storage folder. We had our student worker who was very helpful, who transcribed the interviews and highlighted areas that might be personally identifying information. And then we went through and we reviewed each transcript, cleaned up the format, corrected a few, acronyms, library acronyms that the student worker might not know, and then redacted identifying information. That gave us a final clean document for coding. And for coding, we use MaxQDA, which is a qualitative software. It's kind of like Atlas TI or NVivo. Those are all in the same category. They will work with a lot of textual data and help you organize it and make sense of it. And we were highlighting quotes of interest and looking to kind of cluster them into themes. And so this screenshot is from an early stage of our project. You can see the documents with the pseudonyms on the top left, and then we have a code system that's in process. And as you find that there's certain areas you want to dive into, you can kind of go deeper and deeper into that. And then documents that we could kind of highlight and tag and leave comments on. And at first we thought we would do intercoder reliability and try to have all 4 of us make sure the codes were all the same. And that kind of became enormously stressful, I would say, because it's the pandemic and all of us had a lot more work than usual. So we ended up each taking a different area of the project to kind of dive deeply into and to code as a single person.
And now I'll go ahead and talk about the findings. So our first finding was the librarian staff divide, which was very evident in this study. And what it was a disconnect between staff and librarians, which caused frustration among staff. And one of the main factors that we found, or an extra to it, I should say, is that when a librarian held faculty status, it expanded that divide. So within the divide here, we also found that staff who try to structure their own work, or maybe they're trying to suggest ways to help the organization, librarians would oftentimes block those efforts. And so that made it where librarians were dismissive of, a staff member's efforts to push the library. Another thing that we found was that staff felt satisfied when they could work with librarians as peers. So again, with that hierarchy, they want to work as a peer, right? Working together. And you can see in one of the quotes that we added here is that this person, Joseph, had found that there is definitely a faculty staff divide and that it affects the morale, right? And here he says that the morale at his institution is pretty low. Next slide, please. So our second finding was the impact of management. So we found that staff with low morale were often in toxic settings, or maybe their boss was micromanaging them. And in regards to the micromanaging, the quote here that we have at the bottom, Opal, she had found that her boss doesn't micromanage her. And in that case, she felt like she was in a good environment. She also noted that her boss doesn't have a big ego. Her boss is uplifting, which helps, a staff member grow, and is able to be in a comfortable setting. So again, back to the management, we have someone who feels supported. That was a very big factor. So the support from your manager and being allowed to grow in terms of professional development, opportunities, and things of that nature. Next slide, please. And our third finding was the impacts of family in education. And so here we have education as a factor. And one of the things that we know is that librarians oftentimes don't think that the staff members have either maybe the same level of education or an advanced degree. But we found the opposite. We have majority of our staff had an advanced degree, right? Which it shudders that assumption. And in regards to caregiving, we have that a majority of staff had families. They had a spouse or kids and family needs, which, as we all know, that will definitely impact one's career choice and the ability to either go on or switch a position. And in regards to class, many of the staff brought up that class impacted their career as well. And mostly with class and furthering their education, that's one that we found. So someone doesn't want to advance because of the stress of finances, having to finance this advanced degree of MLIS, for example. Someone doesn't want more student loans. They don't want more student debt. And the quote that we have here is actually a supportive director who has helped find scholarship money for that staff member. Even the small things create an entirely different situation for a staff member. And next slide.
Thank you, Perdita. So I'll talk about the last finding, which was our big question on the impact of hierarchy. So when we started this study, we were expecting this direct relationship between your place in the library hierarchy and your morale at work. What we ended up finding through our interviews is that that question of morale really depended on a bunch of different factors, including organizational factors that were related to your ability to progress, whether you could move up in the hierarchy, the amount of workload that you were given, and your colleagues were given respect, whether you were taken as a peer and whatnot, as well as importantly funding for new hires, whether there was this expectation of there were going to be an even spread of work and new people coming in to be able to help even out the workload, or whether there was just going to be no hiring. When we looked through the transcripts of our interviews to find a really good quote to highlight this, this complication really showed up in the fact that there was a lot of these discussions of like context, and there was this back and forth between a lot of our participants. So this quote here from Amy really highlighted, though, pretty straightforward, this issue of respect and your place in the hierarchy. She's talking about this interview that was done for a librarian position, and the interviewee asked about how long would you sit at the reference desk, like how long am I going to be there? And they're like, the people who are interviewing, like, we wouldn't put you there for more than 2 hours. We wouldn't do that to you. And if you're a staff person who, as Amy pointed out, you're dealing with patrons, you have hard patrons that can be difficult to work with. You have, the stresses of being public facing. You're there for 8 hours a day, but you're expected to do that. And so seeing that, Amy had a very strong reaction of like, why can't you do that? Like, why am I expected to do that, but you can't? So I thought this quote was very strong in this divide and this place in the hierarchy that we were really looking for. Next slide, please. So a lot of our participants also helped us with recommendations in strengthening library staff morale. And they range from different levels, ranging from like things that can be done at the individual level, fostering respect, know what your colleagues are doing and understand what their role is in libraries. Inviting them to collaborate with projects and whatnot. Being a good teammate. We really like this quote of fill your own darn copier tray because that shows good teammate, good initiative, making sure everybody's equal. But it also ranged through these big systematic changes, fighting for fair pay and classification, because that helps with, making sure everybody is treated at a certain equitable level. Asking and being transparent with library staff on big library changes. A lot of our participants noted that, a lot of these changes were being made, a lot of decisions were being discussed without their input. And that affected their morale. And ensuring that those who can't afford the advanced degree, the MLIS degree, can still advance. That was a big issue with a number of our participants to be able to advance without, putting in money, their own money, into a degree that's not going to guarantee them movement. So that was something like these big systematic changes that a lot of our participants wanted to focus on. Next slide, please. So what are our next steps? Well, one, we're hoping to share out this webinar and our ACRL poster. Check that out. We're also hoping to finish our literature review. We welcome suggestions. We really are looking for some good resources out there. We have a good amount right now, but if you have any suggestions on library staff, on hierarchies in academia, send them our way. We're hoping to develop one or more publications from that. So we're hoping a good number of papers can hopefully come out. So keep an eye out for that. I will pass it on to Anne now.
So I just wanted to sort of wrap up the thinking about the morale situation with this slide, which is getting into some of the themes that we may move forward with, either in publication or research. When Natalia and I sort of conceptualized the study, like good social scientists, we had a hypothesis, and it was about hierarchies. And one thing that was really, really surprising to each of us was how rich and deep the content was from the interviews. It really did not sit around that hierarchy theme at all. It went into all sorts of different areas, and it led to a lot of different questions for us that we, since there's 4 of us, it's wonderful. We can explore different possibilities. So we do want to dig further into the experiences of staff in academic libraries and that librarian staff divide and library as faculty versus not. But looking also a little more deeply into the causes of low morale and also the causes of high morale. What develops if you support staff growth in their careers? Many people did feel trapped. They did not feel mobile within their hierarchy, and that can be discouraging for anyone, especially the idea of helping staff grow and develop in terms of continuing education and financial support for that. Natalia found a wonderful paper, and I think maybe we can put the link in the chat later, about hierarchical microaggressions And that there was so many examples of that in the interviews, very, very telling examples, and people got quite emotional about some of the things that had happened to them. And then finally, well, not finally actually, but finally for this slide, is the impact of the functioning of the organization on staff. Because no matter how good your manager is, if your manager is trying to advocate and fight within a dysfunctional organization, there's really only so much they can do. And they may have morale troubles themselves. I do want to add one thing that as I was listening to all of our team talk, I realized we hadn't really specified carefully enough, which is that remember that the people that responded to our call for participants self-identified. And so they sort of said, yes, I'm very interested. That may be overrepresenting people of low morale. It may be overrepresenting people that are extroverts. We don't know. So we aren't making any statements with this that the people that we spoke to are representative, but I do believe that in many ways they do speak for their staff colleagues all over the country in some of the issues they raised. So further research might want to try to find a way to get some more representative information, remembering that I'm the quantitative research librarian. So now I'll hand it over to Celia to wrap up.
I'll add, following on what Anne was saying, that we deliberately chose to look at both low and high morale because we wanted that variety. We didn't just want to pull disgruntled people, but we wanted to see some of the factors that maybe would really encourage people and have them committed in their job. One thing we didn't cover here was that their spaces were really impactful. So if someone was in a beautiful space or a beautiful campus, they felt safe, they had an easy commute, these kind of things made a tangible difference in their experience as a library staff member. Being in the basement usually was a negative. So we have some further reading here. We'll just put it here and you'll have access to these slides later of some resources that we recommend. Next. And we also have an ACRL poster, which is here, and we can share a link to the public version on our institutional repository that kind of overviewed this briefly. It covers a lot of what we're saying today, but with some different quotes, and we're hopefully fleshing that out today. Next. And we'd like to thank you all for being here. Links to slides and recording is on the slide, and some contact information for each of us. As Anne said, we'd be glad to talk with any of you with further questions that you have if it's something that we can't completely address today. And finally, we would love to take your questions. I know that several of you have been submitting questions in the chat. Just as a kind of hierarchy defying principle, we encourage anybody in this meeting who might be a staff member to go ahead and feel free to ask questions before we dive into the questions in the chat.
Okay, well, feel free to post your questions in the chat. I'll try to go through them as they came in. So first one I see is, are staff encouraged to research or write? Librarians tend to study things that they know about. So unless they had been staff, they might not feel comfortable tackling the subject of staff morale.
Can you read the first part of that again? Sorry.
Are staff encouraged to research or write?
I don't know what others on the team think. I think it varies, but yes, generally I see Celia shaking her head. Generally, I would say, as compared to librarians, it's not part of the evaluation process. So pretty much we all have enormous jobs. So that you know, for many of us librarians, the thing that motivates us is that it's part of our evaluation. If it's not part of your evaluation, and in fact, you're sort of doing it on your own time, or there's a little bit of discouragement for outside projects, it's probably not as much the case.
I would add in with that we did talk to one interviewee who was actively researching and publishing and trying to go to conferences as a staff member, and they did encounter some frustration that there really wasn't a place for them to move or receive any tangible rewards for that level of involvement. I think the rest of Janet's question is probably correct, that unless people feel have been staff, they may be a little cautious of taking on the subject of staff morale. And I think as a team, we're certainly glad to have 2 staff members who can kind of enter this area with confidence and experience.
The next question, and I think you answered this later on, but you took notes, but did you record the interviews in case there was two different recollections to what was said? So sounded like you did record and transcribe. And did you find any correlation between morale and the size of the library or institution?
I will just, and Natalia, you can jump in. I will just say that I think there's a few correlation things that we could lean into, but because this was a highly qualitative study, we really would need to go back and code for a few of these things and then kind of cross-tab it. And we have not done that yet, but I'm working on getting the demographics into MaxQDA. So that's certainly something that we could look at.
I will also say that although we weren't able to focus on like the size of the library itself, we did note that there was some correlation with the size of the department that the staffers were part of, whether it was like a smaller department where everybody knew each other versus some of the larger ones. We noticed this was especially departments that were like IT or cataloging versus like the public service, public access departments. The smaller the department, the better morale seemed to come out from the staffers.
I would, so again, you're getting different perspectives on a team. I would say it depended somewhat. There were a few cases in which there had been a lot of attrition, and so they were left doing 3 people's jobs, and
that is true.
In itself to high morale. Yeah. And that people who were in a unique role, they're a leader of a makerspace or ILL or something a little bit different, they had a little more morale sometimes because they have more autonomy in their job versus we're all on the front desk and then you're much more at a manager's whim.
Can I just sort of put in there, and this is not a question that was asked, but it was kind of something that we felt a little like, oh, we didn't really think of that when we were planning the study. We were imagining that we were going to have respondents that were placed in a very vertical hierarchical structure. So library assistant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, librarian 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And what the people who responded and asked to be interviewed showed us was the incredible range of roles. So we had people that were in IT in places where the library and IT were a combined unit. We had people who were in writing centers where the library and writing center was a combined unit. We had event planner, we had an event planner. So the range of roles was really quite stunning too. And many of those people didn't seem to come in contact with librarians much in their daily life. And so that was a piece too, was how sort of integrated and how the daily routine kind of meant that people interacted. Thank you for letting me go off on a tangent.
Was there any correlation between morale and whether the institution had unionized support staff or even staff support committees? And I think later on, there's a similar question, which I will look for. Was that something that was coded, whether or not it was you had unionized?
Natalia, I think you did the most thinking about that.
So we did ask, we did start asking. We initially weren't looking into the union question because we were cautious about the fact that a lot of places are not friendly to unions in a way, or there's like some hesitancy about the union talk. So we were trying to frame the question around the idea of like, is there a place for you to be able to get support, or if there was an issue with like pay and whatnot. Some did mention that they had a union, and some mentioned that they didn't, but they had an outside organization, whether it was like a staff senate or some other council. Whether that was correlated with morale though, and I feel like my colleagues can fill in on this. Celia?
I think we just have to go back and recode for that. So our answer is no. Right now, we have not tried to assign high, medium, or low morale, which we could easily do, and then support staff. I think the other question related was, did you ask about whether staff at each institution had an ombudsperson or non-HR advocate that was accessible to staff? And in many cases, Natalia did prompt for that. In some cases, they were trusted. In some cases, they were not. So I think the union or ombudsperson or staff committee is an essential first step, but they also have to be trusted and able to actually affect the organization.
I mean, if you don't mind my adding, one of the questions that we asked, the way we asked it was, if you had a problem in the workplace, to which resource would you turn to first? And most people, I think, unless anyone else wants to share a different perspective, either would say their manager if the relationship there was good, or coworkers if the relationship there was good. So generally people would want to talk it through with the sort of nearest supportive person. So it didn't seem like the first place someone would go was, you know, okay, this weird thing's happening, I'm going straight to the union. It's sort of, it was kind of handled more close to their orbit first, and then.
Okay, the next question was wondering about morale correlating to whether the librarians do or do not have faculty status.
We could code for that also. My often impression, which is not scientific, is that faculty status tended to place librarians at more of a remove. Sometimes they just weren't as around day to day because of the other activities that they engaged in. And there could be a little more hierarchical snubbing at the point that somebody feels like I'm faculty and you're not faculty, right? Creates that little additional level. Not everyone does that, obviously. Many people are very collegial, but.
And I think some of it, interestingly, because at Berkeley, we are not faculty, librarians are not faculty. I think that the being part of faculty, this is my own personal opinion now, takes the librarian gaze away from anything that's not faculty related. In other words, if they're part of the faculty, they're kind of looking upward in the hierarchy, because there's this kind of aspirational thing about being faculty, and there's the snubbing that comes down from faculty towards librarians. And so the engagement of the kind of career focus is not at all on the same or lower levels. I hate applying that word, but it's how people think. And this is a little intense, but I often during the interviews thought about sort of cycles of abuse in families, that often people who are abusive in families have themselves been abused and it's a kind of a very common pattern. And I'm not saying it exactly applies, but it did come to mind to me often. I'm not meaning to defend librarians who are disrespectful, but.
It's like that I've been hazed, so I'm going to haze you. How about correlations between full-time and part-time having benefits or not, etc.?
I can take this again if you guys want. So one of the things I ended up probing for was that question about class finances. Is this economically stressful to you? Is because often with a staff role, you don't make as much, right? And you can be very much on the edge for your area economically. And so I didn't see a huge difference between full and part-time, because several of the part-time people were had a spouse that was supporting them. And so, you know, they were able to sustain a really low wage because of external support. It really wasn't their staff job in itself. Other people were very much struggling part or full-time, often because they were a primary earner in their family and a staff wage is not sufficient for that. And benefits had that similar sort of, it really depended on your family situation and what resources you had outside of work as to whether a meager staff set of benefits or wages was enough.
I want to say two things, one of which is thanks for the great questions. And the other one of which is, I wonder if Benita and Natalia, you have any thoughts about the part-time, full-time thing from within the staff perspective?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say, I do remember having an interview with a part-timer, and Celia, you said it perfectly. It depended on the household, right? So if there was a spouse who made a lot of money, the person was able to work part-time and be happy with their experiences. We had a part-timer who loved her job, but was part-time, and again had a spouse who made enough money to support the household.
I will also add that it also depended on where they were in the US. We did get a lot of people who were very happy with where they were, if they were part-time or not. And they were also in areas that were not so, they could do that on those wages. and the extra support. I will say from my own personal experience, I have been a part-timer. I've been a temporary hire before in a library, and not so much with the extra support in a very expensive area. That did not contribute to good morale on my part. So it really depended. But yeah, we did get some really high level folks.
Did any of the questions dive into hierarchically different treatment versus simply rude behavior of an individual?
I wouldn't say the questions dived into that, but boy, did we get some earfuls. Some really, I mean, just there were times that we were just sitting in the interviews with our mouths open, like, no, that didn't really happen to you, but of course it had. So yes, there's many ways to be experiencing a toxic environment, and personalities happen everywhere. I think
I would say we did hear, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, sometimes the personalities are enabled by the system. So go ahead, Celia, sorry.
We did hear about lateral, negativity as well. So it certainly isn't all hierarchical. One thing that comes to mind with this question is that often the rude behavior of an individual who happens to be placed high in a hierarchy can have a much more negative effect on somebody below who feels like their job depends on what might just be an irascible person. So maybe there's actually a responsibility the further you happen to be in a hierarchy to be even more careful about your behavior and its impact on others.
Did you come across any scenarios where the decision-making affected both librarians and staff because there was a more lateral divide between the two rather than an hierarchy?
I mean, yes, I think that some of the things that were happening to people were situational. And in fact, I think I saw a chat flash up that asked about the impact of COVID. And so it was early in the COVID outbreak, but we did see things where there were kind of sweeping decisions being made that affected everyone. The responses of administration were not like, if there was a decision to close, there were some people that had hours cut, whereas others could work from home without any problem. And some of that depended on role, but some of that seemed to depend on hierarchy or, well, other things, but that's getting into too much detail. But yeah, I mean, lateral decisions, I think it just depends on the pre-existing sort of structures and relationships, how they will play out. So I'm not sure that's a great answer to that question. Maybe someone else can.
The only thing is that some places it was much less pronounced divide and it was much more collegial. And often I think those might have been slightly smaller institutions where you have to work a little bit more together.
Mm-hmm. But we did hear a lot, and I don't know if it's enough to go back and code for it, but we heard a lot about what the state was doing, whatever state that library was in, what the state's reaction to COVID was and when they closed. And there was actually stories of sort of a lot of chaos about whether a university was going to close, even though the state was requiring quarantine. Sometimes the libraries are seen as like the last place that would be open, carrying on the academic mission. And so there's a lot of very negative feelings about that, understandably. So it was kind of a chaotic time in a way. Maybe people would have been too busy to talk to us if it wasn't during COVID. I don't know.
Did you do any research of academic library staff who have advanced degrees but not an MLIS?
So we did actually ask, we just asked if they had an advanced degree or what their education was. And a couple of our participants mentioned that they had advanced degrees that were not library related. So we did look into that. We also asked them, where they saw themselves going further, in the future. And I feel like Celia, you saw more into this than I did.
So I've looked at we've tried to extract things that we didn't specifically, have a rigid section of our interview that we asked for, and still extract some of this, like what degrees do they have? Did they mention a disability? Did they mention being queer? And because we didn't prompt some of these things, people might not have chosen to self-identify. But we did ask specifically about education. That was one of the questions. And a lot of people did have advanced degrees. Some people were entering a second or third career. They tried one path and it didn't work. So ideally, you would be able to bring those skills into whatever job you're doing now in a library. I think it did feel like there were many people who probably could have taken on more advanced work, but structurally that just wasn't available in their library.
Yeah, and I'll add that some of them who did have an advanced degree and it wasn't an MLIS, the library job that they were in was sort of just like a temporary position that they were trying to figure out if they wanted to stay or if they wanted to go on with the degree that they already had.
I actually think it'd be a really interesting thing to dig into more, because we only had 34 people that were self-identified. So some of these things were kind of like tantalizing glimpses into directions that you could go with research. I did want to say that for some of the institutions, they were already in some financial trouble before COVID. And so there were people that talked about precariousness of their job even before. One thing we had wished, and of course we couldn't have known in advance, is that we had gotten IRB approval to re-interview people a year later. So the only little clue that we have is that we sent out an email letting the respondents know that we were doing this webinar and sort of suggesting that they might be interested in seeing the recording afterwards or whatever. And I did hear back from a few people, and one of them had, I went back to her transcript, actually, she'd been toying with the idea of going to graduate school, and in the email response to us informing them said that she's now pursuing a journalism degree. So it may be that people are pursuing education now because of that whole kind of, wow, I can't count on this the way I thought I could, or whatever. Life is short, I should pursue this or whatever, but we don't really have any way of tracking that.
Did you investigate part-time staff as well? And if you did you discover anything interesting about how they impacted or were impacted by full-time staff, librarians, administration, etc.?
So is this trying to get more at the relationship between morale and part-time?
Morale and part-timers.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a more precarious situation to be part-time in general. If there's any fear of cuts or anything, a part-time person is going to feel more precarious. I don't remember. Does anybody else remember a specific kind of like theme of the part-time people seem to be having a specific?
A couple of part-time people seem to indicate that they were having sharper cuts, right? They just weren't invited back. They weren't given work from home. So kind of in the tiers, you've got a long-term unionized staff member potentially, and that's much more secure than a part-time, short-term hire, something like that. Those people were definitely more affected by the pandemic.
Definitely. Can you talk about other ways to show appreciation of faculty or staff outside of just monetary compensation?
Monetary is best, but and I mean, monetary can be salary, but it could also be sometimes benefits maybe that would not cost the institution as much. I'm not thinking of anything like that right now, but professional development does also cost. There's no getting around that. I mean, I can't think of anything that doesn't sound Pollyanna-ish, because the minute you say we're not going to put money into it, then you're kind of in the land of sort of, potlucks and free movies and kind of morale building exercises that are often fun and wonderful, but make you roll your eyes a little bit because it's not really addressing the need. So I have a slightly cranky attitude towards that question. Maybe someone else. Oh, actually, yeah, seeing the chat. Nice, Alex Bainbridge. That work flexibility, should have said that. That actually is a big and important one. I'll let Celia talk now.
That's what I was thinking, is that when it's not money, then you start looking at time. That's the other main thing, that allowing people more autonomy to structure their time, giving them time for a personal project, even if it's putting up displays or something that they've really been wanting to do that maybe isn't core. I don't think that non-monetary compensation can fix understaffing, because then you can't afford to give somebody time. So there does need to be appropriate staffing for the workload that's being assigned. But if that could certainly include flexibility, opportunity to travel, to go to a local professional development that doesn't cost anything.
But like, what if you took your I'm sorry, Natalia, what if you took your professional development money across the entire staff, including librarians, and equitably distributed it instead of giving it all to the librarians? I mean, that would be something right there.
I think it depends on what the output expectations are, right?
Yeah.
I'll also mention that, being more flexible with the type of professional development, kind of is a big thing. My response to that question, we already talked about monetary, and we already talked about professional development, and, flexibility being the big three, the big ones. I'll also throw in generally understanding what your coworkers do. A lot of people have mentioned that, like, they have a feeling that a lot of their coworkers, a lot of librarians don't understand what they do. A lot of the community members that they work with don't understand what they do, and that caused a bit of low morale. So generally talking to your coworkers and being like, hey, let's talk about what your role is. So I want to hear from Bonita, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about another person that we interviewed, which I would have loved having that for myself at my own institution. But this person had mentioned how their library had like a child center, and they were able to bring their kids in during work hours. And, whenever, if there was an emergency, if maybe there was some sort of time management issue with maybe their spouse, or even just if maybe they picked up their kid early from school. Some of us know about the early dismissal days on Wednesdays and having to leave work and come back. So I think that is an extremely important benefit that people can include.
There was another interviewee who was able to go home regularly at lunch or after work to get his kids as well. So that was definitely the family flexibility is a big thing. And spaces. So there was in one case somebody who the librarians got two offices, one in an offsite and one on-site, and the staff were demoted to like a windowless cubby, and they could have had an office. So it's that kind of, we live in organizations where librarians might have priority, try to make sure people are working in pleasant spaces.
Yeah. If anyone went to ACRL last week or has sort of access to anyone who can sort of sneak them a view of a presentation, Kaetrena Davis Kendrick, who kind of inspired our study, did a wonderful talk about her goals for the library, of which she has just become a dean. And a lot of it focused on staff feeling welcome in their spaces, staff feeling appreciated, staff's needs, morale as a very important aspect of running a library that people should be paying attention to. It was a wonderful talk.
The next question kind of goes back to what Natalia was saying not too long ago, but did anything come out in the interviews about staff awareness of librarian responsibilities away from the desk or library? And if so, did that make a difference in perceptions and morale?
I mean, people would say, I know the librarians have a lot of other pressures. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of the separation can be so extreme that neither side really knows what the other does.
Yeah, I think a lot of our participants, as Anne mentioned that they had an understanding that the librarians did a lot of interacting with faculty and whatnot. But yeah, I kind of would flip. In my mind, I would flip this.
That question around.
Yeah, because you know, that there, as I mentioned, that there were a number of staff members who mentioned that, like, you know, they would get comments being like, they, especially if they were public facing and if they're at the desk and, you know, there is a subject like, you sit here and you do this. And it's like, no, there's more.
I mean, I think in our one slide, we said, really staff are essential to running the library and librarians are not. And I mean, I'm partly feeling that's so much the case in small libraries. I mean, it's the case everywhere, but you can see it in small libraries. I had a situation where I was managing a small library. I had 2 staff and my boss said, we can keep one of you next year. And who should we keep? And the answer was very obviously not me. And I think that's true many places. And I just feel that librarians are told that their work is the you know, the vocational awe, the most important and highest purpose, and it's really not true.
Well, the last question I have, and we touched on this a little bit, but did your participants talk at all about how COVID had impacted them? I know it was very early, but I know the burden often fell much harder on library staff required to keep libraries open during the pandemic.
I'll mention one, and I know I've mentioned this at other places, but I think it's extremely important because one of our interviewees had mentioned the fear of going back due to xenophobia. And as we know, the situation is, there's like no words for what's going on right now. Their fear is valid and it's ongoing, it's still ongoing. So that was just something I wanted to point out, just the situation.
I'll also add one interviewee that really stuck in my mind. They had mentioned that early on they were still working. They hadn't been, you know, told to shelter in place. And that you could see the divide very clearly in that, because they noted that, like, the librarians, the higher ups could go to their office and stay enclosed, but they were still out interacting with the public. And so they felt like that their safety was put out there, you know, without consideration, and that it was totally fine for them to get COVID, but everybody else, you know, they needed to be considered like protected and whatnot. And that really stuck with me.
Yeah, there's a lot of, it was kind of a snapshot of organizations in shock and making bad decisions based on wishful thinking.
Although in some cases, this is the optimist side, we saw people that were making good decisions. People did appreciate communications leadership or trying to make people's jobs. So there's a few.
It's true. No, it's true. It's just the bad ones were really shocking.
One last question. Did you see any differences between types of library departments like archive, science, law, etc., and the issues being reported regarding morale?
Not strongly.
I don't think we had enough variation in the types of libraries to be able to, nothing stands out that I can think of, but it would be really interesting to study that. So thank you for that question.
Well, it is coming up on 1 o'clock, so I will wrap it up. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And Celia, Natalia, Benita, and Anne, thank you for presenting for us. I hope everyone will take a few moments to complete our survey and let us know your thoughts about the presentation today and about our programming in general. The survey link should show up at the bottom area of the presentation screen or in the chat.
I'm working on that, and it also should get emailed to everyone who registered. Sorry.
No problem. As a reminder, the recording of this presentation will be available on the Pennsylvania Library Association members early next week through the association website. If you're not a ACRL member and you are interested in becoming a member, please feel free to email me and I'll have the appropriate person contact you. I also invite you to contact me with your suggestions for future discussions and presentations, and I most definitely invite you to contact me if you would like to present. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you for coming.